Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about the financial exploitation of senior adults. But first, we're joined by Berwood Yost, director of the Floyd Institute Center for Public Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College. You recently released the latest poll results that were compiled October 9th through the 20th. We'll go through some specific data in just a moment, but first, did anything overall surprise you?
Good morning, Francine. It's nice to see you today. I don't know if surprise is the right word, but there were clearly a few things that stood out. One is that if you look at the overall kind of sentiment and concerns of Pennsylvania voters, it's pretty clear that Democrats are facing a lot of headwinds. Concerns about the economy, concerns about people's personal finances, their dissatisfaction with the direction of the state, their dissatisfaction with the performance of the incumbent president. All that points to, I think, a real opportunity for Republicans in the state. At the same time, the race is really close. I mean, given those headwinds, you would expect Republicans to have a clear advantage. They don't. In fact, even though the race is probably best described as a tie or a toss-up, given the environment, I think we would expect the Republicans to have some advantages. Those are really the big takeaways. There's a lot of other stuff in the poll, including how kind of irritated Pennsylvania voters have become with the campaign and all of the attention on the state. And we can maybe talk about some of those things as well.
So let's start. We'll look at some of the data you have from the poll. We'll start with the presidential race. I'd like to look at two sets of data back to back. First of all, on the presidential race, registered voters, 48% in favor of Harris, 44% for Donald Trump, 2% other, 5% undecided, and then very next image, likely voters for the presidential race, 49% for Harris, 50% for Trump, 1% for other. When you look at the difference between registered voters and likely voters, what do you derive from that, the differences there?
So I guess one of the things we saw at the time we did the interviewing, and we have to remember that this is a description of a point in time. It just seemed that the folks who were supporting Donald Trump and the Republicans were a bit more excited, a bit more likely to turn out. And when you look at the comparison of registered voters to likely voters, you see that the likely voter pool is more Republican, has fewer moderates and fewer people under 35. The moderates and the people under 35 are groups that support Kamala Harris and Bob Casey in larger numbers than, say, other groups. And so by the electorate, by the pool of registered voters, when you move to likely voters, having fewer of those voters in it, it makes the races much closer and essentially toss-ups.
How did these results align with polls that were conducted a little bit earlier this year?
The registered voter numbers are pretty consistent. The likely voter numbers, this is the first time we did the likely voter numbers. We think it's appropriate to start doing those comparisons as you get closer to Election Day, since obviously a lot can happen between August and November. But I would say that the race has been remarkably stable. In August, it was relatively close. I think Harris had a bit of a boost. We polled in September right after the first debate. She got a little bump there, and it's now settled back down to where it was previously.
Let's look at favorability now. For Kamala Harris favorability, 49% favorable, 50% unfavorable, 1% don't know. On what issues do voters find Kamala Harris favorable?
Well, it's interesting. She's really improved her standing on a number of issues and a number of traits. And so things like someone who best understands the concerns of ordinary Americans, somebody who's honest and trustworthy. She's really improved or maintained a big advantage over Donald Trump on things like that. Donald Trump still has an advantage on who's best able to handle the economy. But in fact, even that advantage has shrunk some. And so I would say going into the final days of the campaign, the final week, what really stands out and what is really an advantage for the Trump campaign would be to emphasize economic matters. For Harris, it's to emphasize kind of character traits and perhaps even continue to try to win voters who have concerns about the economy, because there's a lot of them. A third of voters, a little more than a third of voters, told us that the most important problem facing the state is the economy. If this election is decided just on the economy, I think it's a real advantage for Trump and for Republicans.
Now, on the other side of that coin, Donald Trump's favorability, 44% favorable, 56% unfavorable. Now, just a moment ago, you mentioned that Donald Trump seems to have an advantage with folks that are concerned with the economy. But looking at both candidates' favorability and unfavorability, do you find that voters tend to go to the polls more motivated by somebody they like or to vote against somebody they don't like?
That's a good question. I think that's going to ultimately be determinative of this race. Despite Donald Trump's favorability ratings being underwater, he is far less underwater than he was in 2016 when he won Pennsylvania, or 2020 when he was the incumbent president. So he's actually improved his favorability ratings over the last 8 years, but they're still negative. And I think one of the things that we see in the survey is that there are a number of people who say they think they know who they're voting for, but they could change their mind before Election Day. And a lot of those people are independents and people who align with the traditional faction of the Republican Party, traditional Republicans. There's a segment of both those groups who say, I'm still thinking about my vote. And that's where some of those people with an unfavorable perspective of Mr. Trump are at. They're in those two groups. And so at the end of the day, your question is a good one. They could make their final decision based on how they feel, how comfortable they are with him being in office. And that's going to be the real storyline, I think, going into the election.
Now let's shift our focus to the U.S. Senate race. We're going to look to two sets of data back to back. Once again, first of all, registered voters for the U.S. Senate race. Bob Casey, the Democrat, 49%. Dave McCormick, the Republican, at 42%, other 3%, undecided 7%. And then when we look at likely voters, Bob Casey is at 49%. That remains the same. Dave McCormick, 48%, other 2%, undecided 1%. How do these results align with what you've seen in previous polls for this race?
Again, the race is narrowed a little bit in the Senate race. And it has, I mean, if you're looking at just registered voters, Senator Casey still has a comfortable lead, somewhat, 6 or 7 points, and that was consistent with previous polling. But when you make that move to the likely voter sample, as with the presidential race, because the composition of likely voters at the time we did the poll was a little different than the registered voter pool, that race looks much tighter and appears to be a toss-up. And I think what's important to remember, Francine, in both of these races is there's very little ticket splitting. We're in an age now where voters are polarized. They're voting mainly along party lines. There are very few voters who are going to vote Casey Trump. And there are very few, almost no voters who are going to vote Harris McCormick. And so when you get to the most dedicated voters, those who are most likely to vote, they tend, at least for these federal offices, to vote similarly. It is very rare these days to send someone to the Senate from a different party than the president. And that's true in Congress, that's true in the Senate. And I think that's a big storyline. I suspect if Donald Trump wins this state, that he may bring Dave McCormick along with him, although there are more Trump Casey voters. It's only like 1% of all voters than there are Harris McCormick voters. And so that could potentially save him if this race ends up being that close.
Let's look at favorability very briefly. Bob Casey's favorability, 42% favorable, 40% unfavorable, 18% don't know. Now, Bob Casey has been a U.S. Senate since 2007. Is his 42% favorability on par with somebody who's been in office for that long?
Yeah, look, in this day and age, if you're viewed more favorably than unfavorably, that's a plus. And I think generally voters of Pennsylvania tell us they like Bob Casey. They're more positive about him personally than negative. I think that's his advantage. The other side of that, though, is Dave McCormick has improved his name recognition among voters. One of the reasons that the race is a little tighter than it was before is that in earlier polls, there was a sizable share of Republicans, about a quarter, who said they weren't sure who they were going to vote for in the race, or maybe they were voting for a third party or someone else. In our last poll, the number of Republicans supporting McCormick is similar to the number of Democrats supporting Casey. So Republicans have really sort of come home as Dave McCormick has made himself better known, particularly among his base.
And Dave McCormick's favorability, 38% favorable, 44% unfavorable, 19% don't know. Dave McCormick's unfavorability rating is higher than his favorability. 19% polled still say they don't know enough about him. Is his biggest challenge, as you just kind of mentioned, name recognition, or are there other issues that he needs to focus on?
Yeah, I think the early Casey advertising cast some doubts among Republican voters, tying him to his hedge fund management, his ties to China, his record there, and in fact, not being a resident of PA was a claim that the Casey campaign was also making. I think that all raised doubts in some voters' minds that might have supported him. I think those voters appear to be coming back to the Republican Party, and so I think that's part of the story here. McCormick's told his side of the story, whereas early in the campaign, Casey was able to have a lot of that messaging advantage. McCormick has definitely caught up in the advertising side, and I think his message is tying Casey to a very unpopular administration has been effective.
One last piece of data we're going to look at, and this is issues of concern. State issues of concern, economics and policies are 35%, government and politicians 10%, taxes 6%, crime 6%. When you consider these issues, what voters rank the highest, does that give you an indication of how you think they will vote at the polls?
You know, that's a great question, and that's something we're still thinking about, because when you ask the question that you just read, economics are clearly at the top of the list. But when you go back and you ask people why they're supporting one candidate or the other, you actually see a different set of issues. Of course, party and policy comes to the forefront for many voters. They're Republicans or they're Democrats and they support those candidates. But if you're talking about something like the presidential race, if you're supporting Kamala Harris, you're probably talking about democracy as your most important issue, or women's rights as your most important issue. If you're voting for Trump, you're most likely to say the economy or perhaps immigration is the most important issue. So, you know, I think we're still trying to understand what's going to drive voters at the end of the day, because if it's all about the economy, that certainly favors Trump and Republicans. But if it's about a mix of issues, which it seems like it might be from that question that we ask about who you're supporting and why, then that could lead to a different outcome.
Berwood Yost, thank you for joining us once again.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests are Jessica Jones, Director of the Berks County Area Agency on Aging, and Kevin Shivers, President and CEO of the Pennsylvania Association of Community Bakers. The Office of Attorney General estimates that criminals stole between $260 million and $2.1 billion from Pennsylvanians over 60 in 2022. Kevin, we'll start with you. How do you define financial exploitation of Pennsylvanians, and why does it seem like this number keeps increasing, why this keeps happening?
Well, you know, we in the banking industry are looking at that as, you know, not only family members, domestic cases where people are trying to extract a little bit extra from the checking account, but we're talking about opening up lines of credit, establishing loans, selling, buying houses. All of those ways are, you know, injurious to the elder person. In many instances, we're talking about some type of an impairment, intellectual or physical or otherwise. And in many instances, seniors don't understand that they're being taken advantage of. Something that we're seeing a proliferation of recently as seniors have become more akin to going on the World Wide Web and being active electronically with their financial information. We're seeing a real rise in electronic banking and financial fraud, and it's costing seniors hundreds of thousands of dollars in these scams where people, and they call it pig butchering, where people are assuming identities and they're using those to hustle senior citizens.
Jessica, why do you think that seniors in particular are vulnerable to this type of exploitation?
I think what we often see with this type of exploitation, especially relative to the scams, and as Kevin mentioned, it's a socialization aspect, and you have these individuals who are developing relationships with these seniors, and then what happens as a result of that development of this relationship, then it begins to become trust and give me money, help fund me, I need information. Maybe it's a sweetheart scam, maybe it's just supporting a local, or the thought that they're supporting something locally. So those are the main pieces that we're even seeing as far as the financial scams are concerned, is that relationship of trust.
And it's costing seniors $1 billion a year. Banks since 2013 have filed 180,000 suspicious activity reports. That doesn't even scratch the surface about the actual fraud that's really happening. The latest numbers that we're seeing from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is that 1 in 5 people over the age of 60 are falling victim to some type of financial exploitation. So when you think about this studio, there's somebody here, Francine, whether it's somebody, your camera crew, your producers, or us here at the table, one of us is going to become a victim of financial exploitation.
Now, Jessica, for those that aren't familiar, can you talk a little bit about the role that area agencies on aging have in protecting seniors against these types of scams?
Sure. So our office, we receive lottery funding. We provide in-home services, home and community-based services for individuals. The main goal of an area agency on aging is to keep individuals at home with additional services and supports. One of the program areas that is very critical for us is protective services. So typically what would happen, and our role is we will receive what we call a report of need. So a report of sort of alleged abuse. It could be financial, it could be physical, it could be emotional abuse. It just really depends. And sometimes the different types of reports, we're getting multiple things reported at one time. And our roles in protective services is to go out, complete an investigation, determine if there is risk to the older adult, and then make the determination, how can we sort of help them get out of that risk? So if it's a financial exploitation case, is it shutting down bank accounts? Is it helping them to sort of secure everything to ensure that they understand what they're doing and the decisions they're making and the financial impacts it can have on them?
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the special relationship between your financial institutions and particularly seniors, and how your institutions are often the first line of detection or defense?
Absolutely. So the banks that I represent, community banks, are the smallest banks. So they're about 300 employees tops. On average, a community bank has about 50 employees, and they develop a very close personal relationship with their customers. Oftentimes, those customers will come in to do their banking personally. They'll see them at the drive-through window. They'll talk with them about their financial needs in their community. So they're especially attuned to their everyday lifestyles, and they're very particularly sensitive when those lifestyles run differently. And so then they'll start to ask questions. In addition to that, community banks are trained. There is federal training through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, to talk to bank employees about what to spot and to ask questions when certain people are looking at making certain deposit requests, et cetera. So for us, it's personal when you're watching a loved one or a friend, take advantage, a caregiver take advantage of one of your customers. But the rules are written in such a way right now, Francine, that there is really a limited ability for a bank to get involved, or at least to raise their hand and to report that they think that there's suspicion. And that's what we're trying to fix, and working and partnering with the AAAs, the AARP in Pennsylvania, is to allow a bank, if they suspect some type of financial fraud, the ability to raise their hand and to be able to tell someone. Privacy laws in our country and in our state preclude us from being able to talk to a loved one, a family member, somebody on the account, other people about your loved one and maybe their spending patterns or what you might have seen at the teller window or at the bank window. And then as well, to be able to get involved when a transaction just doesn't seem right. We had a bank just recently report to us, an 85-year-old gentleman came to the teller window because he wanted to withdraw $50,000 in cash. And, the teller just asked, boy, that's a lot of money to be walking around with. Well, I want to buy a car. Well, where do you want to buy the car? Because we can certainly write you a cashier's check. No, the customer said, I need it in cash. Well, that's a lot of money to walk around with. Why don't you tell us where you're buying the car, and we can talk with them and we can make arrangements for a wire transfer to be made. Well, I haven't decided which dealership I'm going to. And this line of questioning was so curious that the teller went to her manager, who went to another person in the bank, and they were able to talk this gentleman down. And sure enough, this was a scam. And the thing is, the bad guys are developing relationships, as Jessica was mentioning, building trust, and then they're coaching them how to avoid all of the warning signs during those bank interactions. Go at a certain time. Look for the most disengaged teller at the line that you think isn't, is too busy to do something else. Tell them that you're buying a car or it's some kind of a special prize. And they're literally coaching these customers to do that. And the challenge is, under law, a bank is precluded from preventing you from accessing your money. So the idea that a bank can talk somebody out of a transaction, it's really difficult. So what we're trying to do with legislation is to be able to provide immunity to banks so that A, they can raise their hand, they can report these suspicious activities to our allies in the AAAs and law enforcement, to family members, but also to give them the ability to temporarily hold a transaction when we think there is a suspicion that that senior citizen is being victimized through fraud.
The temporary hold is really a critical area when you consider kind of the complexity of these issues, and it allows the banks and our office then to ultimately have some conversation, and then us also to be able to do some face-to-face interactions with the older adults to really begin to understand where is this coming from. And as you mentioned, Kevin, we are continually seeing more brazen scams. These scammers are very brazen. They're very sort of in their face. They are demanding of older adults at times, and they can be threatening. So.
Now, the legislation that you're getting toward, House Bill 2064, sponsored by Representative Joe Hogan, it's been the subject of 2 recent hearings this fall before joint Senate committees. Maybe, Kevin, could you give us just a brief explanation about what this bill would accomplish?
Sure. We approached the Governor Shapiro, last January to talk about this legislation, even before we went to the legislature to look for a sponsor. And the idea, again, to give the bank the ability to raise their hand, to be with immunity, to be able to report suspected cases of abuse, to provide a bank immunity to hold a transaction temporarily, and to allow for the reporting of this type of financial crimes. And in return, the banks offered to become mandated reporters under the law, which is historic. I mean, there are only a handful of states where financial institutions are considered mandated reporters under their older protective services law. So with the changes that we were proposing in the original version of House Bill 2064, Pennsylvania would have had the 5th strongest, or one of the top 5 strongest financial crimes prevention laws in the country. Surprisingly, we were on the fast track. We've been trying for 15 years to update Pennsylvania's Older Protective Services law. Our banks were getting frustrated because we're watching this type of crime happen every day at the teller window. We're doing everything we can to thwart those types of crimes, but we have very limited tools to do so. And so this was our attempt, while we're having the broader conversation about the larger Older Protective Services law, let's protect the senior's pocketbook and let's do something to help them where it really hurts them financially, where it protects the seniors and hurts the bad guys financially. We thought we were on the fast track. In fact, we found a sponsor, Representative Joe Hogan from Bucks County, a freshman, who took this issue on with incredible leadership to be able to move this forward, and actually was able to move this piece of legislation out of the Commerce Committee and onto the floor of the House. It was fast-tracked for a vote in June, and then all of a sudden the system, just typical in Harrisburg, things blow up. Out of the blue, the state attorney general came forward and accused banks of being co-conspirators of a crime of elder financial fraud. That, in their view, financial crimes were happening not because the bad guys were getting more proficient and changing their tunes, but it was because banks were letting it happen, which was wholly offensive to our industry. And as a result, there were some amendments added to the legislation that passed and is now in the Senate that could completely destroy the relationship between seniors and their banks. There are significant penalties in this legislation now. A bank could be subject to liability of up to $250,000 per violation. The intent of this legislation now is to force a bank to stop every transaction by a senior citizen, which would limit the independence of a senior, but also it would, we think, could lead to debanking, that seniors who haven't lost their faculties might actually withdraw their deposits and put them under the mattress out of fear that someone would be preventing them from making a transaction. We're working with the state Senate right now to bring some reason. We're actually partnering with our allies at the AAA's and with AARP to bring some reason to the conversation. Nobody wants a law that would make it harder for a senior to access their money. Nobody wants a law that would punish banks for trying to do the right thing and identifying and combating fraud. So the process continues, and we're hopeful that we can come to an agreement. Probably we're going to have to wait for the next Attorney General, someone who's a little bit more reasonable in the conversation.
We're going to continue this discussion about this legislation in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our guests a brief break and look at what's coming up on PCN. The election is only a few days away now. On the issues has Jim Lee, President and CEO of Susquehanna Polling and Research. He'll tell us about the latest survey that asked voters about the candidates and issues that are most important to them. You can watch that Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Right after that, we'll look at election 2024 from a healthcare perspective with Leslie Dock from Protect Our Care. That's this Wednesday at 7:30. And then we'll introduce you to one other candidate on the November 5th ballot, Chris DeLuzio, a Democrat running for Congress in southwestern Pennsylvania's 17th District. He'll join us Wednesday at 8 p.m. On Journalist Roundtable this week, Steve Ulrich of Politics PA, Ryan Dito of Trib Live and the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, and Tom Reese from WESA in Pittsburgh all join us for the latest news from the state capitol. They'll be here Thursday at 7 o'clock. PIAA Championship time on PCN. We'll have the boys and girls individual golf for you. The competitors include the top 10 from both the 2A and 3A divisions. That's this Friday at 7 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free online. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, we've been talking about House Bill 2064, which deals with the financial exploitation of seniors. Jessica, I'd like to give you an opportunity to weigh in on this bill as well.
Sure. So some of the other additional, as far as the financial piece, that's very critical. But the other pieces that are worth mentioning that this bill will increase is it increases the mandated reporting requirements. So it will now mirror what we call the under 60 protective services. It will also allow us greater flexibility in having some additional conversations with the financial institutions, because that has been an area that is difficult for us to ensure that we are getting timely responses and getting necessary records so we can conduct our investigations in a timely manner. Also, as it relates to the mandatory reporting thing, believe it or not, in the older adult protective services, the way it currently stands in our law, physicians and hospitals are not mandated reporters. So this would expand that piece. There is a large portion of our current investigations that are held up with just getting that response and feedback from a physician. Mm-hmm. The reason why it's so important to understand, for the viewers to understand why we need that feedback from a physician, is they are typically people that will see individuals, they have an understanding of their medical needs, their history, and they're able to give us that sort of understanding of the individual as a whole as we begin to then look at a case and make a determination on outcomes. So those are some of the other areas. Also, it expands criminal history background checks. So this would certainly enhance the ability of facilities to ensure that with the expansion of the criminal history background checks, that they are not hiring individuals in a very vulnerable into a very vulnerable population and serving those individuals. So those are kind of some of the other big main areas as it relates to.
Now, Kevin, when we're talking about the original bill that Representative Hogan had offered, you talked about giving financial institutions immunity. Can you talk about why this immunity is important and perhaps some of the challenges or limitations that financial institutions currently face if they're dealing with an exploitation situation?
Sure.
And how far you're allowed to go to help protect that individual?
Yeah, so when you are a bank customer, the expectation is that there is a level of privacy and that you're not going to be talking about the financial circumstances of that individual with anyone. And that's just that's just good financial security sense, right? Is to limit the amount of information that a bank can share with some other party about your circumstances. And as well, one of the concerns you have is in legislation, if you are going to authorize a bank to hold a transaction for someone by virtue of their age, and that's what we're talking about. So anyone over the age of 60, a bank would be able to hold a transaction. You're discriminating against that particular customer. So there needs to be immunity from our ADA law, our Americans with Disability Act, and there also needs to be immunity from violations of privacy. And many senior citizens are very frustrated and angry when they're confronted with the fact that they may be a victim of suspected fraud. There's a lot of embarrassment, there's pride, there's frustration with the ability that maybe their faculties are starting to diminish. So these conversations oftentimes don't go friendly and are thoughtful, but they're met with a lot of hostility. How dare you question my judgment of putting $10,000 in a crypto ATM? How dare you question the reasons for wanting to withdraw $60,000 in a way that I've never done that before? And so there have been some hard conversations with bank CEOs and their customers who've threatened to withdraw their holdings in their bank and put that under the mattress. And we want to be partners to the protection of older adults. We've been with them as a partner through their entire lives as they've earned that money and have built their nest egg, and we want to ensure that they have the ability to enjoy a lifestyle that they've now deserved. So giving a bank the ability to ask the questions that they need to ask, to reach out to a family member if they think that one could be appropriate, be able to provide information to law enforcement or the AAAs. One of the big concerns that we've been, and we were talking about this off camera, is that we can provide that information to an area agency on aging, but then what happens to keep that secure? The last thing we want to do is develop a list of senior citizens who've been victim of fraud, because now if that got into the hands of the bad guys, that becomes a sucker list. So now the bad guys have a list of every senior who's been exploited and knows that those individuals are susceptible to exploitation. These are really complex issues that need to be thoughtfully worked out. Our banks stand ready, and we've been working with AAAs. That level of communication can only strengthen if the underlying principles in House Bill 2064 were enacted into law.
Jessica, do you also find that seniors are hesitant to report incidences or suspicion of fraud, perhaps for embarrassment or other reasons?
Absolutely. Embarrassment or just that and the embarrassment of the lack of understanding is a big piece of what we see. But to kind of piggyback on one other, what Kevin had mentioned, when you look at these seniors who are now going through what would have been their nest egg, he talks about their nest egg, what ultimately then happens is the funds are not available to these individuals to age in place, age with dignity, and have that ability to have some choice. And also, ultimately, it's taxing then a different system, because now these people cannot pay for their care. So now it's kind of coming back onto the taxpayers, and it's really just we're all basically getting scammed in some way or another when you think of it in sort of that bigger picture. So my biggest take home when we talk about the scams and remembering that these are individuals, we need to approach every case and every individual as a person. We try to be my workers are very well trained in looking at an individual case. When you've seen one case, you've seen one case. And we talk about the scams as the larger sort of scams, Nigerian scams, whatever they may be. But then we also see families that are exploiting people. And I think sometimes there's an even higher level of embarrassment around that, as opposed to just even I've been scammed or I've clicked on the bad link and this happened. When it's a family member, it really becomes real for these people. And that's the hard conversations really that we often see. So we talk about that piece, but there's a whole second piece around that, and how to address that with individuals and how to approach them in a really sort of nurturing way, and trying to get them to see your niece or your nephew did this to you, and how can we help you to unravel this, and what can we offer you to ensure that this doesn't happen again. That's not an easy conversation.
And the consequences are extraordinary. We're watching, when you have a senior who's lost their life savings, you're forcing them to return to work in some instances. You're talking about being strained for relationships with their family who may have expected some type of an inheritance, but now that's gone. You look at, as you were saying, Jessica, now being forced into a nursing home or other facility, suicide. So there's just a whole host of serious consequences resulting from this type of fraud. And as I was mentioning earlier, some of these really hard conversations that bank CEOs are having with customers who are really irate about the thought that they're being questioned about their money. Under this legislation, we now can have a conversation with a AAA who'd be able to intervene in that circumstance, and then to be able to provide the supports that that particular senior would need. So it's not just a one-on-one conversation between the bank and the senior citizen, we now have a partner in the AAAs who'd be able to provide other types of supports to be able to help in that circumstance. It just makes sense. I mean, all of us can work together to be able to protect our senior citizens.
Now, Kevin, when we were talking about the proposed legislation, you mentioned that some of the amendments included penalties for banks that can make this overly onerous. During the Senate Joint Committee hearings, there was some discussion about wanting to make financial institutions have skin in the game. So what kind of incentives or what kind of skin in the game do financial institutions have to help seniors to retain their own finances without these onerous penalties being part of the bill?
Well, the skin in the game that a financial institution has is the reputation risk of doing it wrong. A bank that's going to allow their senior customers to be defrauded time and time again is going to develop a reputation in that local community, and the depositors are going to take their decisions with their feet. They're going to pull their money and go into a financial institution that cares about them. For community banks, we know our customers. The idea that we don't have skin in the game is really an insult because we care about them. We want our customers to be successful. We just want to have the ability legally to be able to be a partner to those in law enforcement and in our senior services community to be able to fight this type of fraud. I do think that sometimes skin in the game also is a watchword to the litigation industry, right? We're just going to increase the number of lawsuits, and we're going to make trial lawyers happy because they'll now be able to sue the biggest banks. And, you know, we'll deal with another unending limit of liability and litigation. When really all we need to do is give banks the ability to raise their hand, give them ability to temporarily hold a transaction when we think there is fraud, to give them ability to be able to partner and to actually have conversations with the AAAs without the threat of violating privacy or an ADA law, and again, empowering the AAAs and law enforcement to have conversations with the seniors.
Jessica, can you talk a little bit about what goes into an investigation of potential fraud and what kind of resources are all involved?
Sure. So what we take what I would consider a holistic approach when we look at these investigations. So an initial report, as I mentioned earlier, the report of need comes in on an individual. We're going out, we're seeing that person in their home environment. So that and that is the best place to see individuals, to really have those conversations and to really understand how they're managing as a whole. Because the one thing Kevin and I spoke about earlier in the green room was a lot, not every time, but often if individuals, and we get these types of calls and it's definitively someone falling victim to a scam, there's probably other aspects in their life that are beginning to sort of fall apart. But we have those, to answer your question, I'm kind of getting off subject a little, but we go out, we do our investigation, we request bank records, we have contacts with the physician, we have a certain process of how we move through our investigations, and as we move through that investigation, all the while checking on the older adult, checking in with them, trying to understand the decisions they're making, looking at their bill paying abilities, and just the general overall picture. Are they going to the doctor? Are they taking medications? Are they functioning on a day-to-day? Are they giving too much money to a scam or to a charity and they're not able to pay their regular bills, or they're not able to make ends meet just to buy groceries? This is kind of the holistic approach that the workers take when they're looking at individuals. And then dependent upon what the findings are, it's really sitting down with the older adult and developing what we call a care plan to identify how are we going to help you with this, securing accounts, talking to a family member perhaps that now could be your power of attorney and help you to make some of these decisions and help you weed through all of these weird emails or texts or information that you're getting or notices or invoices that you don't understand. Sometimes you just need someone to support you in those things. So that's really our goal and how we look at this. Our interventions are short term. They're not a long-term case, that we have open forever. Once those interventions are identified and we identify those in the care plan, then we move forward and end up reassessing and sort of closing the case and making sure that all the risk areas are addressed.
Now, we've been talking a lot about legislation aimed at dealing with this. Where's the legislation in the process right now?
So the legislation, House Bill 2064, passed the House in June. It's now in the Senate Banking and Insurance Committee. The Banking and Insurance Committee and the Senate Aging and Youth Committee have held 2 joint hearings to talk about this issue. I've been really impressed with the dialogue. There are an awful lot of people who, especially the senators in particular, both sides of the aisle, who understand how serious this issue is, but also understand the ramifications of doing it wrong and want to be thoughtful about the process. And I think we've had some really good conversations with stakeholders in the room. Like I said, I've been very disappointed in our state attorney general for insisting on legislation that, if it were enacted, would be similar to that which was vetoed in the state of California just recently by Governor Gavin Newsom. We want to be able to help seniors. The longer this goes, it's just a longer delay in giving banks the tools and be able to partner with our AAAs in protecting our senior citizens. And the scams, Francine, are extraordinary. They could be as simple as a text message that you get that there's, fraud that's been detected on your account, and click on this link to learn how. Well, don't click on the link. The first thing you should do is contact your bank directly by phone, and don't use the number that was in the text message. Go to the website and call the bank with the number that you see on the website, or go through your Rolodex and look for the information that you've seen from your bank. Another big type of scam is somebody will send you, they call it pig butchering. They'll send you a picture of your house. We know where you live. Put $20,000 in a crypto ATM, and we see this regularly. And so somebody gets frightened and, oh my God, they know where I live. They're going to harm me. Well, they picked up that picture of your house from Zillow. They're probably half a world away. Many of the frauds that are taking place, the bigger frauds, are not domestic at all. They're happening in the states, nation states like North Korea and in Asia and other places where they literally have corporatized this type of fraud. People are making these phone calls from big buildings or warehouses, and the scams are pretty sophisticated. They'll build your trust. And it always involves putting money in a crypto ATM, which should be your first indication that something is amiss.
Jessica, I'll give you the last word. Additional things that seniors should look out for to avoid scams.
So, in addition to the links, also I would encourage you to ensure that you actually are looking at your bank statements when they're coming in, because even though you have the potential for these fraud and these scams, the other big piece is watching family members have access to some of these things. And so really not realizing that someone is pulling money out of your account on a routine basis. I can't tell you how many cases we have seen where individuals are just blown away by the fact that this is happening. So that really, to me, is a very big piece, and really trying to make a decision when you have been sort of hacked or you've had those problems, having the conversation with your bank, having the conversation with another family member to really help you to make sure that you're able to secure everything and that you're able to actually meet that, or to secure everything and to ensure that it can't be happening again and again and again. Because like Kevin had mentioned, these individuals are actually continually, they get more and more, they're on lists, so they get these calls. I've had workers who are in people's homes and they're getting 6-7 phone calls within an hour. And not just from one scammer, it's multiple scammers. So once your name is there, it is really hard to sort of get out of that mix. And so really working with individuals to help you, other types of institutions to help you to secure things, is probably the biggest message I would give everyone.
Jessica Jones, Kevin Shivers, thank you both for joining us today. Thank you. Earlier I spoke with Todd Eaches, president of the Broadband Communications Association of Pennsylvania. We're joined today by Todd Eaches, president of the Broadband Communications Association of Pennsylvania. The organization you represent held a Broadband Communications Technology Day at the state capitol recently. Can you talk a little bit about the goal of having that event there at the state capitol?
We did. BCAP members from all across every corner of the Commonwealth are doing amazing work and have done so for generations all across Pennsylvania. And we wanted to showcase not only those companies and the work that they're doing, but with all of the hubbub going on around broadband, we want to show the complexity behind that, because I think that sometimes gets lost in policy discussions, just what it takes to build, maintain, and sustain these networks.
Can you talk a little bit about who participated at that day at the Capitol, and also what kind of exhibits and educational opportunities were there?
Sure, we had members and associate members displaying some things throughout the rotunda. Everybody from Breezeline and Comcast, Service Electric, USIC, the locate company, and SCTV, the Society of Cable Television Engineers, that sort of sets the standards for some of the technology. We're there to just show, again, the complexity of these networks.
How does teaching about the technology help lawmakers as they're crafting relevant legislation that might fit into that circle?
Great question, and that was really the point, is that we have so many dollars potentially flowing into the Commonwealth to get to those unserved folks that still exist, particularly in rural areas. And as policymakers think about how to plot that course and be successful, we have advocated for getting the obstacles out of the way, stretching every last dollar of these taxpayer dollars to ensure success. And we need to tell the story of what's been going on, how well our member companies and all broadband providers did during the pandemic as people went home to work and go to school and worship and just stay connected, and what it took to do that and how successful we were and what the future looks like. But in order to be successful, we need to knock down the barriers and obstacles. And I hate to say it, but sometimes government gets in the way of itself. Even though they have lofty policy goals, removing obstacles should be the critical emphasis at this point.
How did the COVID pandemic exacerbate awareness of the need of expanding broadband to all these underserved areas?
Well, so many people, as I said, went home to work and go to school, et cetera. And then that gap of those folks who just did not have access to reliable, safe, robust broadband service, when they went home, they weren't connected, they couldn't work, they couldn't worship, they couldn't educate. And we saw people going to fast food parking lots to get Wi-Fi just so they could get homework assignments, et cetera. And so that's shown a spotlight on the fact that we have more than 250,000 Pennsylvanians who just don't have access and will not be able to participate in the economy at that time and in the future economy.
Now, as you know, Pennsylvania was awarded $1 billion in federal funding to help expand that access to broadband in underserved areas. Can you talk a little bit about the progress that's being made and what your experience has been thus far in trying to access this funding?
Well, it's been a long and slow slog through a very complex federal program. And you're right, Pennsylvania is going to be the recipient of more than $1 billion to get this work done. It's sad to say that it's been more than 1,050 days since Congress authorized $42 billion across the entire nation. And since that time, more than 1,050 days ago, not 1 foot of cable has been put in the ground, not one person across Pennsylvania or across the entire country has been served yet. And part of that is because of plain old-fashioned government red tape. Now, here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Broadband Development Authority, the organization in government who is setting the rules, has done a lot of work and made a lot of progress. And we've negotiated so many terms and so many rules. It's not perfect, but our members are ready to get access to that money and get those Pennsylvanians connected that so dearly need it.
Can you give me some specific examples of the red tape that you talk about? What kind of requirements have been causing these delays?
Sure. Well, the federal government, for instance, has imposed so many peripheral elements to it. And we've said from the very beginning of this that the laser focus needs to be on serving the unserved. And if it became a program that was something other than that, then we risk failure. Unfortunately, the federal government, this administration has imposed environmental regulations, has imposed extraordinary accounting and other regulations and labor regulations that are very, very burdensome. And then right here in the state, Pennsylvania has elected to apply its prevailing wage statute, and that's fine. But we have asked from the beginning for them to create relevant job classifications, and they've said no. They insist that we use the electric lineman rate, which is an extraordinarily hourly rate, north of $90 per hour, which just shortens the spending power of those dollars and risks that we leave some Pennsylvanians behind.
Do the costs of expanding broadband into these rural areas increase as the time takes longer and longer for you to actually access this funding?
Well, I think it does. I think naturally we all know that we went through a pretty high time of inflation. That inflation shortens the spending power. We still have supply chain issues. Labor issues will always be present. This work takes a lot of complexity. It takes a lot of manpower. It takes a lot of technological equipment. And all of that in an inflationary environment is challenged, and there's tension there to make those dollars stretch in that kind of economic environment.
What can our state officials do to help ease the process while you're still trying to access this federal money?
Well, there's a lot of things that can be done. First, when it comes to specifically the programmatics, create rules, think of what it takes to reduce those barriers and get out of the way. Frankly, it's just about getting rid of the red tape that is often so common in government programs.
As we speak, we're getting near to the end of this 2-year legislative session for state government. As we look forward to a new session, what will your legislative priorities be?
Our legislative priorities looking forward are going to be ensure the programmatics are right, but also continue to reduce those barriers at the state and local government levels, things such as permitting, things such as pole attachment. Fiber is attached to utility poles. Our guys don't own them. There are agreements between them. We need to have rules that allow quick access and reasonable financial terms. Other things like railroad crossings. Those are all part of those obstacles that can impede quickness to the marketplace and make it far more expensive than it really has to be.
Todd Eaches, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That concludes today's show. A reminder, the election is only a few days away now. On the Issues has Jim Lee, President and CEO of Susquehanna Polling and Research. He'll tell us about his latest survey that asked voters about the candidates and issues that are important to them. You can watch that Wednesday at 7 p.m. Right after that, we'll look at election 2024 from a healthcare perspective with Leslie Dock from Protect Our Care. That's Wednesday night at 7:30. Then we'll introduce you to another candidate on the November 5th ballot, Chris DeLuzio, a Democrat running for Congress in southwestern Pennsylvania's 17th district. He joins us Wednesday at 8 p.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.